Happening now, breaking news, Russian cover-up. The Pentagon says there is no doubt the Syrian regime is behind the deadly gas attack on civilians, and the U.S. strike was meant to deter further chemical attacks. U.S. officials can't say if Russia was complicit in the gas attack, but they do accuse Russia of trying to cover up what happened. Showdown with Putin. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson arrives in Moscow, slamming Russia's role in Syria as Russian President Vladimir Putin doubles down, defending his support for the Syrian regime and criticizing the U.S. Amid a war of words, will the two men meet? Offensive comparison. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer says even Hitler didn't use chemical weapons and is forced to make a hasty clarification after ignoring the fact that the Nazis used poison gas in their death camps during the Holocaust. And mode of war. North Korea calls the deployment of a U.S. aircraft carrier force an act of aggression and says if provoked, it's ready for any mode of war, including nuclear war. In a CNN exclusive, we'll take you inside North Korea. I'm Wolf Blitzer here in the Situation Room.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Breaking news, the Pentagon says it's very clear the Syrian regime planned and executed the chemical weapons attack, which killed dozens of civilians, including many children. It says the U.S. strike on a Syrian airbase was meant to deter further chemical attacks and warns the regime will pay a very stiff price if it uses those weapons again. A war of words between the United States and Russia is playing out as Secretary of State Rex Tillerson begins a visit to Moscow. Before he arrived, Tillerson hit Russia's role in Syria, while the Kremlin has been criticizing the U.S. U.S. officials say there's no definitive proof of Russian collusion in the chemical weapons attack, but they say Moscow is trying to cover it up. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer stumbled today when trying to shame Russia over its alliance with the Syrian regime. He argued that even Hitler, quote, didn't sink to using chemical weapons. Spicer was quickly forced to clarify his remarks, given the Nazis' use of poison gas during the Holocaust. And North Korea is calling the deployment of a U.S. aircraft carrier battle group an act of aggression and is warning of a nuclear strike if it's provoked. President Trump says that Kim Jong-un's regime is looking for trouble, but the White House says the North Koreans do not yet have the capability to launch a nuclear attack. I'll talk to the senior Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Adam Smith of Washington State. He's standing by live. And our correspondents, analysts, and guests, they're also standing by with full coverage of the day's top stories. Our breaking news. The Pentagon says it's very clear the Syrian regime carried out the chemical weapons attack that killed dozens of people. Let's begin with our Pentagon correspondent, Barbara Starr. Barbara, top officials, they're leaving absolutely no doubt about who's to blame.
In this extraordinary press conference, Wolf, the top Pentagon brass wanted to send several messages. Some things were clear, some things were deliberately ambiguous. Defense Secretary James Mattis telling me on that he wanted to be ambiguous about whether the U.S. would now go after chlorine-filled barrel bombs from Assad, but he was ambiguous on nothing else. The Pentagon top brass not yet ready to say Russia was complicit, but definitive on Bashar al-Assad's involvement.
There is no doubt the Syrian regime is responsible for the decision to attack and for the attack itself.
The U.S. missile strike telling Moscow the Trump administration will use force and is already not ruling out further military action against Assad, but hoping that the Russians temper their own actions.
I'm confident the Russians will act in their own best interest, and there's nothing in their best interest to say they want this situation to go out of control.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson arriving in Moscow today also laid down a marker.
I hope that what the Russian government concludes is that they have aligned themselves with an unreliable partner in Bashar al-Assad.
But Russian President Vladimir Putin calling the missile strike reminiscent of the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
This very much resembles the situation in 2003 and the war in Iraq. The Iraq campaign was launched, and it finished with the destruction of the country, the growth of the terrorist threat, and nothing less than the emergence of ISIS on the international stage.
And warning Syrian rebels may have more planned.
We have information from various sources that this kind of provocation, I can't call it anything other than a provocation, is being prepared for in other regions of Syria too, including the southern suburbs of Damascus, where they are preparing to drop similar chemicals, and then accuse the Syrian government of it.
But the U.S. says the insurgents don't have sarin, and in turn pressing the American case that the Russians bear responsibility for the chemical weapons attack. The U.S. intelligence community now investigating how much the Russians knew about the attack ahead of time. The U.S. knows there were Russian forces at the base, and they likely knew about chemical weapons at the base and flight operations happening there. The U.S. also knows a Russian drone flew over the hospital treating victims, and an unknown fixed-wing aircraft dropped a conventional bomb 5 hours later, trying to destroy evidence.
Allahu Akbar.
Only Syrian and Russian aircraft fly in the area. So no definitive conclusion yet that it was the Russians who were complicit in this, a lot of circumstantial evidence. And what about the Syrian Air Force after the U.S. missile strike? The Pentagon now calculates it damaged or destroyed 23 Syrian aircraft at that base, about 20% of Syria's operating Air Force. Wolf?
Barbara Starr at the Pentagon, thank you. Let's go to the White House. Our White House correspondent, Sarah Murray, is on the scene for us. So what's the latest there, Sarah, on Russia's role in Syria?
Well, Wolf, this White House may not be able to say what Russia's role, if any, was in that attack, but they were crystal clear today on one thing. They do believe Russia played a pivotal role in trying to cover up for Assad and the Syrian regime in the wake of that grisly chemical weapons attack.
President Donald Trump silent for yet another day on what his next move is in Syria. In the 5 days since the president's strike in response to the chemical weapons attack against Syrian civilians,
I ordered a targeted military strike.
The Trump administration still struggling to clarify how it will respond to future attacks, as questions persist about the role Russia may have played.
Has your view changed on the president? Thank you all very much.
Trump refusing to answer questions today about whether his view of Russian President Vladimir Putin has changed. This as a senior administration official accused the Russians of waging a campaign of disinformation in the wake of the attack, saying Russia tried to cover up the Syrian regime's culpability. The White House says the intelligence community still has not reached a consensus about whether Russia had a heads up before the chemical weapons attack.
There's no consensus within the intelligence community that there was involvement.
But a senior administration official appeared to put more pressure on Russia today, questioning how Russian forces could not have had forewarning about the chemical weapons attack if Russian forces were interspersed with the Syrian troops that planned and carried it out. Today, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer argued Russia is growing increasingly isolated in its defense of Syria.
In this particular case, it's no question that Russia is isolated. They have aligned themselves with North Korea, Syria, Iran. That's not exactly a group of countries that you're looking to hang out with.
But he stumbled when offering up this condemnation of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's cruelty.
You look, we didn't use chemical weapons in World War II. You know, you had someone as despicable as Hitler who didn't even sink to using chemical weapons. So you have to, if you're Russia, ask yourself, is this a country that you and a regime that you want to align yourself with?
While many historians believe Nazi Germany did not use chemical weapons on the battlefield in World War II, Spicer's comparison appeared to overlook the Nazis' horrific use of gas chambers. According to the U.S. Holocaust Museum, nearly 2.7 million Jews were murdered in killing centers by poison gas or shooting. Later, Spicer tried to clarify his remarks with this.
I think when you come to sarin gas, he was not using the gas on his own people the same way that Assad is doing. I mean, there was clearly, I understand your point. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. There was not he brought him into the Holocaust Center. I understand that. But I'm saying in the way that Assad used them, where he went into towns, dropped them down to innocent into the middle of towns, it was brought to it. So the use of it, I appreciate the clarification there. That was not the intent.
Now, since that briefing earlier today, Sean Spicer has offered another clarification to that clarification, this one in the form of a written statement. Spicer says, "In no way was I trying to lessen the horrendous nature of the Holocaust. I was trying to draw a distinction of the tactic of using airplanes to drop chemical weapons on population centers. Any attack on innocent people is reprehensible and inexcusable." Wolf?
Sarah Murray at the White House, thanks very much. Joining us now, the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Adam Smith of Washington State. Congressman, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf.
I want to quickly get your reaction to the Sean Spicer comments on Hitler and the use of poison gas. We know that Hitler used poison gas to kill millions of people, including millions of Jews. Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the House, she just called on the White House to fire him. What's your reaction?
Well, I mean, it's obvious that Sean Spicer needs to know a lot more about history when he's making his comments, and those comments were insensitive and ignorant without question. Not the first time. So, and also, you know, Assad does not have to be worse than Hitler in order to be a real problem, in order to be somebody worthy of our condemnation. I could tell that Mr. Spicer was freelancing there, and obviously he was out of his depth. You know, I don't know if he needs to be fired or not, but he certainly does need to get better at his job.
Do you agree with White House officials who believe Russia is trying to cover up the Bashar al-Assad regime's culpability in that chemical attack that killed so many civilians, including children?
Yes, I don't think there's any question about it. They're deflecting the blame from Assad. And look, I mean, given the presence of Russians on the base where the attack was launched from, it is very hard to imagine that they weren't aware of it. But at the end of the day, Putin doesn't care. He simply wants Assad in power, and he will kill whoever he has to kill to help make that happen. And the international community has to recognize Russia for the rogue actor that they are. They are encouraging this type of despotic regimes wherever they can. And that is really the threat of Russia. I mean, when Putin started, messing around in Ukraine and other places, that is but a small piece of what he is trying to do. He is trying to undermine liberal democracy every place he can, and basically, he's trying to make the world safe for autocratic dictatorships. And we, in the United States, as the leaders of freedom, should stand up against that and stand up strongly and try to rally the international community to recognize not just Assad's role in this attack, but Putin's role in this and in many, many other actions that are undermining freedom in this world.
Well, let's be specific. Do you believe the Russians actually worked with the Syrian regime to conduct these chemical attacks?
I don't know. Like I said, it's hard to believe, given their relationship, that they weren't aware of it. On the other hand, it's hard to believe that they would be so stupid as to allow this to happen. I mean, Assad was basically winning. Russia had come in and propped him up. Why they would do this with the international condemnation that was sure to follow, I'm not sure. But again, given the close relationship, it's hard to believe they didn't know. But I don't know for sure. I do not obviously have intelligence that has a smoking gun that clearly says that Russia knew a chemical attack was coming. It's just hard to imagine that they didn't.
Congressman, you've said in the past that the Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad should go. So how do you think that should be done? And try to be as specific as you can. What needs to be done to get rid of him?
Well, two things. I mean, we need to separate the question of whether or not Assad is the legitimate leader of Syria with the question of what do we do to take him out. And I think there was some bad early steps by the Trump administration that essentially seemed to say that it was okay for Assad to stay in power. We were going to focus on ISIS. So I think independent of the question of how you would go about removing him, just stating clearly that given the brutality that Assad has rained down on his own people, he is not a legitimate leader. And also, ISIS will not be defeated as long as Assad is there. He is a rallying cry, given the way he brutalizes his own people, for many in the Arab Muslim world. Now, the next question is, how do you remove him? Well, I am not a fan of regime change. I think we've learned a lot from Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan that us, as an outside power, being able to step in and remove Assad, number one, extraordinarily difficult to do, and number two, you got to know what comes next. And right now, we don't. So it is an impossible situation. I don't suggest that there's any easy answer here, but at a minimum, we should call Assad out for what he is and not imagine that he can be some kind of ally in the fight against extremism. He cannot be. He is not. In fact, he fuels extremism because of the brutality of his rule.
But do you think it's realistic to think he could be removed as long as he has the very strong support of the Russians, the Iranians, the Iranian-backed Shiite groups like Hezbollah, all of whom are supporting his regime?
Honestly, you know, I don't. I mean, I think that's the problem with all those groups that you just mentioned supporting him. He is able to stand in power, and that presents an enormous challenge to the international community. I want to make sure that we don't overreact in the U.S. and think that there is some military solution and think that we can go in there and go to war not just with Syria but with Russia and Iran and not cause even more damage than is currently being caused. Look, the images are horrific. What Assad has done is horrific. But we also have to be mindful of our limitations. And I think in the past, certainly in the case of Iraq, you know, we overthought what we could do. Saddam Hussein was awful. If we remove him, things will get better. Well, it's not that simple. The United States doesn't have the power to simply step in and fix other countries. That doesn't mean that we don't take whatever steps we can to try and move it in a positive direction, but I think you outlined perfectly the very realistic challenges of making, you know, any sort of significant change in the short term.
Yeah, you make a fair point. Muammar Gaddafi was a very, very bad man, but the U.S. and others helped get rid of him. But take a look at that Libyan state today, a failed state with ISIS having a significant foothold in Libya right now in North Africa. Congressman, we have more to discuss. We've just heard, by the way, from President Trump. He's now weighing in on all of this. We'll tell you what he's saying right after this.
Call toll-free at 1-800-400-5415.
Our breaking news, the Pentagon says there is no doubt the Syrian regime is behind the deadly gas attack on civilians, but tensions are also rising on the other side of the world as North Korea reacts angrily to the deployment of a U.S. carrier force moving towards the Korean Peninsula. We're back with Congressman Adam Smith of Washington State, the ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee. I want to get to North Korea in a moment, Congressman, but just moments ago, Fox Business released an excerpt from an interview that they just did with President Trump, on a part of it on Syria. Let me play the clip for you.
We're not going into Syria, but when I see people using horrible, horrible chemical weapons, which they agreed not to use under the Obama administration, but they violated it.
They said they got rid of them.
Hey, look, what I did should have been done by the Obama administration a long time before I did it. And you would have had a much better, I think Syria would be a lot better off right now than it has been.
Although I want to point out, back in 2013, when the Obama administration did not respond to the use of chemical weapons with a military strike, he did at that time tweet, he was a private citizen, what I am saying is stay out of Syria. He also tweeted rebels just as bad as the regime. He said stay out of Syria. Now he says the Obama administration should have moved. What's your reaction to all of this?
Well, first of all, I hope at some point President Trump realizes that he is in fact president and should take responsibility for what's going on instead of continually blaming other people for everything, most notably President Obama, but certainly he blames others. So that's the first point. And the second point is I hear what he's saying about the chemical weapons, but Assad has murdered and butchered his own people with conventional weapons as well. And that is extraordinarily problematic. And what is the Trump administration going to do going forward if Syria continues to use chemical weapons? I mean, I supported the strike. I think it made sense to respond that way. But we also have to be mindful of the limitations of that. It didn't do too much damage to Syria, and we still don't have a clear policy from the Trump administration about how they plan to work towards an alternative to Assad. And I certainly don't want the policy to be what it had been prior to this chemical weapons attack from the Trump administration, which was basically, well, Assad's okay because he's with us on fighting ISIS. That is not the case. We need a different policy.
Let me talk about North Korea with you for a moment. You're in Seattle, Washington. The former CIA director, Michael Hayden, has said soon, he says within the next few years, North Korea will be able to reach Seattle with a nuclear weapon. North Korea warned it is ready to react to any mode of war desired by the U.S. Those are their words. If the U.S. were to make some moves toward a preemptive strike, how serious is a threat like that from the North Korean leader?
Well, I think the threat's very serious. North Korea, obviously, they're an incredibly dangerous country. The fact that they already possess nuclear weapons makes them even more dangerous. You have an unbelievably unstable leader in Kim Jong-un. What I'm worried about is I don't want us to miscalculate and do something that would prompt a reaction. Look, North Korea already has nuclear weapons. They are already a threat to the international community. The best way to contain them, in my mind, is to make deterrence absolutely clear. That there are lines that if they step over in terms of attacking South Korea or Japan, anyone in the region, much less us, then we will obliterate them. Because the one thing about Kim Jong-un, he is not suicidal. Part of the reason he's building all these weapons, the nuclear weapons, testing missiles, is he wants to discourage anyone from trying to take him out. And I think what we have to make clear is he cannot attack any of his neighbors if he wants to survive. I don't want us to do something premature. I mean, given the nuclear weapons he has, and even given the conventional weapons that are already trained on Seoul, a nation of, I think, a city of around 14 million people. So any kinetic action on our part, trying to prevent him from getting further down the line with ballistic missiles, I think is more likely to have worse consequences than if we simply maintain a very strong deterrent posture.
Yeah, his conventional military capability is enormous. Just north of the demilitarized zone, he's got 1 million troops, thousands of artillery pieces, missile launchers, and Seoul, as you correctly point out, a huge city only about 30 miles south of the DMZ. The stakes clearly are enormous. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf. I appreciate the chance, as always.
Coming up, more on the American warships approaching the Korean Peninsula as North Korea is raising the specter of nuclear warfare. Meanwhile, President Trump is reacting to the escalating tensions on Twitter. Stay tuned for a special report.
The most trusted name in news.
The breaking news, Pentagon officials now say they have no doubt the Syrian regime is behind a deadly chemical attack on its own civilians. At a briefing today, the Pentagon declined to directly link Russia to the massacre, but officials did accuse the Russian military of attempting to destroy evidence of the attack. John Kirby, you used to work at the Pentagon, the State Department. Trump administration deliberately now accusing the Russians of trying to cover up the Syrian chemical attack. How significant is this?
Well, if it proves true, it's enormously significant. I mean, look, there's no question that at least those Russian forces at the bases had to know something. But to be complicit in it, to actually try to cover it up, that's a significant charge. And I suspect that that Secretary Tillerson, at least I hope, he raises that when he meets with Foreign Minister Lavrov later today.
And he might meet with Putin, too. We don't know if that's going to happen. But we know he's going to meet with the foreign minister. Phil Mudd, the White House, as you heard, they say there's no consensus in the U.S. intelligence community right now about whether Russia was actually complicit in organizing the actual chemical attack. But one U.S. official is telling us that Russia will have to answer how it could share that air base that was knocked out by those Tomahawk cruise missiles with Syrian regime forces and not know of this chemical weapons strike. What's your answer to that?
Look, I think this is simpler. I think they are complicit. Let me tell you what's happening in the intelligence community. Before the attack, I suppose you could make an argument about the difference in intelligence between what you think. For example, we're 70% certain at CIA that the Russians know, and what you know. We can guarantee you, Mr. President, that they were aware of the attack. The significant question, though, Wolf, is let's go to the past 4 days. What do they know now? Presumably, they've talked to Syrian officials. They're on the ground at the airbase, but furthermore, they've got their own intelligence assets. They have human penetrations, I guarantee you, of the Syrian government, and they have intercepts of the Syrian military. And you want to tell me afterward where they still continue to cover up for the Russians that they still don't know? I don't buy that for a second, Wolf. They got to know.
John Kirby, you buy that?
I think there's certainly a level of knowledge here. That how high it goes, I don't know. But I think Phil's right. I mean, I think certainly there's in the last 4 days they have gained more knowledge, more context about what happened.
We know there was the Tomahawk cruise missile strike, Nia, but is there a real Trump administration strategy some call it doctrine, that is unfolding right now?
There doesn't really seem to be, and you've seen some shifts even over these last couple of days. Tillerson initially said that the fate of Assad would be up to the Syrian people. He is now saying that that Assad's reign over Syria will come to an end. I think the question still in terms of the policy is, what does that mean? How does his reign come to an end? And when does it come to an end? You heard from General Mattis today where he said that the U.S. has no intention of going full bore into this very complicated civil war. And in some ways, we're still, in some ways, I think, at Obama's strategy with the threat of another response in the way that we saw from this Trump administration if there is a similar chemical attack. So I think that's in some ways where we are, the Trump administration learning the same lessons that the Obama administration found out, and now trying to put that pressure on Russia in the same way that the Obama administration did, with little sense that there'll actually be results.
Ron Brown,
the difference is now that on the wake of this attack on the airbase, there may be some leverage now for Secretary Tillerson. He may have some advantages at the table tomorrow that Secretary Kerry didn't have.
Because of the attack?
Yeah, in terms of rattling the Russians' cage a little bit, and with our willingness to use force against the regime. Now, it was carefully and scripted and very narrowly focused, as Secretary Mattis made clear today, about the chemical attack. But still, it may give Tillerson just a little bit of an edge here in these talks.
You know, Ron Brownstein, Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, said today that Russia could be compelled to be more cooperative, give up its support for Bashar al-Assad, because right now the Russians are in the same team, he said, with Syria and Iran. Yeah. And that's not a team you want to be on. How realistic is that?
Well, look, I mean, I think these events of the past week have so totally disrupted the gyroscope of the way the Trump administration came in thinking about Syria, but also about Russia. The dialogue during the campaign and even into the first weeks and months of the administration was essentially, we will put off the question. We will essentially tacitly accept the rule of Assad in order to get Russia's cooperation against ISIS. That's what the president during the campaign most explicitly talked about as the benefit of a reset with Russia, that they would join with us against ISIS. What's become clear, and again is clear today, that more important than dislodging ISIS from Syria is, to them, to Russia, is stabilizing Assad's rule in Syria. And I think, John, you know, you'd have a better sense than I, but I don't think experts believe that Putin wants to give him a blank check, wants to be on the hook for anything he might possibly do. But the idea that they are willing to quickly give this up and shift their focus, as we wanted during the campaign, toward ISIS, I think has been one of the other things exploded in the past week.
You know, Phil Mudd, there has been a clear, what the diplomats would call evolution in the president and President Trump's strategy, thinking about what to do in Syria. You've seen a dramatic change, haven't you?
It's not an evolution, Wolf. It's backfilling. That is, the president saw some photos and decided to do something, and the diplomats said, heck, we better figure out some strategy behind this in the last 96 hours to explain why we're doing something. Let's be clear here. We're trying to corner the Russians after an election campaign where the president cozied up to them. In the past week, a week and a half ago, we saw Secretary Tillerson say the Syrians should decide their own solution. Now we're saying not only should somebody should take Assad out, but that we're trying to isolate the Russians. What happened in the past week that didn't happen in the past 6 years? We have a butcher who's murdered 400,000 people. He used chemical weapons in 2013. He's been allied with the Russians for years. What led the president to change his opinion? I'm afraid that emotion by looking at photographs led him to strike, and then the diplomats said, heck, we better come up with something in the wake of that strike to explain why we did it. I think there's zero strategy here.
All right, guys, stand by. There's more to discuss. I want to get everyone's reaction also to the White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer saying at that briefing today that even someone as despicable as Hitler didn't use chemical weapons. We'll be right back. The Trump administration is making its case for missile strikes against the Syrian air base following the deadly chemical attack on civilians. But the White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, is now scrambling to try to clarify some comments he made comparing Bashar al-Assad to Adolf Hitler. Listen to this.
We didn't use chemical weapons in World War II. You know, you had someone as despicable as Hitler who didn't even sink to using chemical weapons. So you have to, if you're Russia, ask yourself, is this a country that you and a regime that you want to align yourself with? When you come to sarin gas, he was not using the gas on his own people the same way that Assad is doing. I mean, there was clearly. I understand your point. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. There was not in the. He brought him into to the Holocaust Center. I understand that, but I'm saying in the way that Assad used them, where he went into towns, dropped them down to innocent into the middle of towns. It was brought. So the use of it. I appreciate the clarification there. That was not the intent.
After the briefing, he issued this statement, Sean Spicer, quote, "In no way was I trying to lessen the horrendous nature of the Holocaust. I was trying to draw a distinction of the tactic of using airplanes to drop chemical weapons on population centers. Any attack on innocent people is reprehensible and inexcusable." John Kirby, you were the State Department spokesman, the Pentagon spokesman. What was your reaction to that?
Yeah, I cringed, I have to admit. I mean, you look, rule number one, you never compare Hitler to anything. I mean, it's just, that's not
never
smart.
Ends well.
It never ends well. Yeah. I think, frankly, he made it worse when he tried to explain it in the briefing, and then in his statement, the only thing you can say is, look, I misspoke, I was wrong, and apologize, and then let it go. I thought in trying to explain himself in the statement, he actually only made it worse.
What did you think, Phil Mudd?
Well, I agree. The explanation was worse, but there's 100 angles to this. Let me give you the first one I reacted to in addition to the outrageousness of the remark. If you're Rex Tillerson going in to talk to a brazen dictator in Moscow or to his foreign minister, you just gave him a talking point. As soon as we try to isolate the Russians, if I'm the Russians, I'm saying, you want to develop a partnership with us? And 24 hours ago, you said we were worse than Hitler? I expect you to apologize publicly, Secretary Tillerson. I think this makes the talks in Moscow more difficult. I mean, you're looking at this in terms of decision making. I've never been to a spokesman. But as John was saying, you either never talk about Hitler or you can run out in a lightning storm and grab the tallest tree. Which one do you want to choose? I mean, epically bad judgment that's inexplicable, Wolf. I don't get it.
You know, and Ron Braunstein, it's a liability for the Trump administration because all of a sudden people are talking about this as opposed to some other issues that they would clearly prefer us to be talking about.
Competence matters. Execution matters. The sentiment that Sean Spicer was trying to express was one I think has broad, that most Americans would agree with, you know, basically saying to Russia, is this really where you want to be in the international community? That point got totally lost in the execution. And by the way, if you look at where Donald Trump is overall as president, with this 40% approval rating, much lower than anyone else, I think most experts agree it is about competence, demeanor, the approach to the presidency more than it is at this point about agenda. Competence, execution, those things do matter at this level.
Yeah, when I heard him say, and I'm sure you did as well, Nia, that as despicable as Hitler was, he didn't sink to using chemical weapons. I said, what is he talking about?
Yeah, and then he used the phrase Holocaust centers, which he, of course, meant gas chambers. I don't think anyone has ever used the phrase Holocaust centers. And the other thing here is that if he is really comparing Assad to Hitler and saying in some ways Assad is worse than Hitler, then you would imagine that the U.S. would have some urgency to act to remove Assad. So it goes to sort of a policy argument if, in fact, that is what he's arguing. But again, not a good day for Sean Spicer. And he hasn't, in some ways, had a good run. I mean, he's become a caricature on SNL. Yeah. He mispronounced Assad's name in that briefing. So, I think it goes to what Ron was talking about in terms of competence.
Yesterday, he was mispronouncing his name as well. You saw that Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the House, she just issued a statement saying the White House should fire him.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, that's the president's choice. And I think, as I said, the underlying sentiment that he was trying to get at was an important one that I think most Americans would agree with. And I think most people would have been pleasantly surprised by the degree to which they have called out Russia. Rex Tillerson's statement this morning in Italy, where he said that it didn't, whether it was complicit or just inattention, didn't matter to the dead. That is a powerful moral statement that was perhaps stronger than many people would have anticipated from the Trump administration in the wake of this. But all of that, again, gets lost. Competence, execution, they matter.
Now, here's the thing. I mean, Assad's brutality doesn't need to be compared to anything. Right. It's bad enough as it is. And look, I think it's great that they took this strike in retaliation for the chemical attack, and I'm glad that Secretary Mattis came out today and explained that they're not afraid to do it again. That's where you just need to leave it. Making comparisons from that podium, particularly that comparison, never a good idea.
All right, stand by, guys. There's more news coming in. President Trump scolds Kim Jong-un on Twitter, accusing North Korea of looking for trouble, but the regime isn't backing down, raising the possibility of a nuclear strike. CNN is on the ground in North Korea right now with the latest details. Our exclusive report, that's next. North Korea is calling the deployment of U.S. carrier group an act of aggression and is warning of a nuclear strike if it's provoked. President Trump, meantime, tweets that Kim Jong-un's regime is looking for trouble. CNN's Will Ripley is inside North Korea for us right now. Let's go live to Pyongyang. Will, what's the mood over there?
Well, this really is an unprecedented situation here, Wolf. We've never seen dynamics like this with North Korea. We've heard North Korea threaten nuclear attacks against the United States for quite some time, but never before have we had a U.S. president responding with such fiery rhetoric, and it seems as if both sides keep upping the ante, and nobody knows if a military confrontation could possibly be on the horizon. Brand new images of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un presiding silently over the Supreme People's Assembly in Pyongyang. The man they call Supreme Leader sitting beneath giant statues of his father and grandfather, North Korea's two late leaders. The symbolism is clear. The third-generation leader, like his father and grandfather before him, continues to hold absolute power over North Korea and its growing nuclear arsenal. That arsenal has become central to what many here see as a potential showdown with the U.S. After a frantic series of North Korean missile launches, this week the U.S. moved warships, including the aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson, off the Korean peninsula. That move prompted an angry response from the North Koreans overnight, hand-delivered to us in Pyongyang. Calling the warships reckless acts of aggression, the government told us if the U.S. dares to choose a military option, the DPRK is willing and ready to react to any mode of war desired by the U.S. President Trump responded in turn on Twitter today, writing, "North Korea is looking for trouble. If China decides to help, that would be great. If not, we will solve the problem without them. USA." And in a second tweet, I explained to the president of China that a trade deal with the U.S. will be far better for them if they solve the North Korean problem. Blunt words for the Kim Jong-un regime and for Chinese President Xi Jinping, who made no promises of specific action against the North Korean government after meeting Trump at Mar-a-Lago last week. China is North Korea's only meaningful trading partner, but it's not clear how far China is willing to go to rein in Pyongyang, or even if economic pressure would work. Tensions on the Korean peninsula at their highest level in years, with U.S. warships off the coast, and just days after President Trump ordered a missile strike on the Syrian government, perceived by some inside North Korea as a thinly veiled threat. This North Korean newsreader saying, "We are not intimidated." North Korean state media warning of a nuclear strike if provoked. And we are now just 3 days away from North Korea's most important holiday of the year, the Day of the Sun. And North Korea has a track record, and it has for a long time, of projecting strength and power around their major holidays, often with provocative military activity. It was 5 years ago that they tried to launch a satellite into orbit just 2 days before the Day of the Sun. Will Kim Jong-un order his nation's 6th nuclear test? Will he roll out a mobile missile launcher and fire more missiles? And the really unknown question tonight, Wolf, how will President Trump respond?
Important questions indeed. Will Ripley reporting from Pyongyang, North Korea. Thank you. Coming up, as the Pentagon blames the Syrian regime for a deadly poison gas attack, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer says even Hitler didn't use chemical weapons and is then forced to make a very hasty clarification.
He was not using the gas on his own people the same way that Assad is doing. I mean, there was clearly, I understand your point. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. There was not in the
Happening now, breaking news. No doubt, top Pentagon officials say there's no disputing who was behind the gas attack in Syria in a new explanation of why the U.S. retaliated against Bashar al-Assad. Tonight, President Trump is speaking out about his next moves in Syria. I'll get reaction from former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. Face off with Russia. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is in Moscow for tense talks about the Kremlin's support for Syria. As the White House accuses President Vladimir Putin of a cover-up, how tough will Tillerson get? Spoiling for a fight, North Korea threatens to launch a nuclear attack if provoked as U.S. warships move closer, and President Trump warns Kim Jong-un to stop making trouble. Are the two leaders on a collision course? And high-priced travel. We have an eye-popping new estimate of the cost of the president's frequent trips to Mar-a-Lago and Palm Beach. Will he spend more on travel in 1 year than President Obama spent in 8 years? We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm Wolf Blitzer. You're in the Situation Room.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Breaking news tonight, President Trump addressing fears that the U.S. strike in Syria might lead to a full-scale war, declaring in a new interview that we are not going into Syria. This, as Defense Secretary James Mattis says, there's no doubt Bashar al-Assad's regime planned, orchestrated, and executed the gruesome chemical attack that prompted President Trump to order the missile strike. Right now, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, he's in Russia to deliver a very tough message to Moscow about its support for the Syrian regime. A senior White House official says it's clear the Kremlin is trying to cover up for Assad, but the administration is stopping short of directly accusing President Vladimir Putin of being complicit in the gas attack. As tensions escalate, Putin is firing back, denying the Syrian government was behind the chemical attack, claiming Assad was framed by rebel forces. The Russian leader accusing the U.S. of basing its attack in Syria on false information, just as it did during the Iraq War. Tonight, we're also following new threats from North Korea. State-run media now claiming Kim Jong-un is prepared to launch a nuclear strike against the U.S. if provoked. As U.S. warships deploy to the region, President Trump is renewing his vow to act alone to stop North Korea's nuclear ambitions if China refuses to help. This hour, I'll talk with former Obama Defense Secretary and former CIA Director Leon Panetta. And our correspondents and analysts are also standing by as we bring you full coverage of the day's top stories. First, let's go to our senior diplomatic correspondent, Michelle Kaczynski. She's in Moscow right now with the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Michelle, the United States and Russia are exchanging very tough accusations as Tillerson begins his visit. What's the latest?
Right. Well, from what we've been hearing from each side over the course of the day, seems only to be widening the gap of understanding between the U.S. and Russia, seems to be making cooperation even more difficult. For Rex Tillerson, he was here just 4 years ago, being awarded the Order of Friendship by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Today, he arrived as U.S. Secretary of State, with friendship being about the last way you would describe the situation. At this point, Putin won't even schedule a meeting with him. And Tillerson is preparing to confront Russia over its role in Syria. Tonight, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in Moscow, about to attempt one of his toughest conversations. Here to tell the foreign minister, if not Vladimir Putin himself, who so far has not scheduled a meeting with him, that Russia needs to, quote, rethink its backing of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and that the U.S. will hold Russia accountable for the continuing carnage there.
It's clear to all of us that the reign of the Assad family is coming to an end. We are not presupposing how that occurs, but I think it is clear that we see no further role for the Assad regime longer term.
A senior U.S. official today accused Russia of trying to cover up what happened there. What Tillerson is up against, a Russia that has called U.S. strikes on Syria an inadmissible act of aggression, intensifying the tension between the two countries. Russian President Putin today suggesting that the Assad regime and Russia are being framed for the chemical attack, saying more will follow.
We have information from various sources that this kind of provocation, I can't call it anything other than a provocation, is being prepared for in other regions of Syria too, including the southern suburbs of Damascus, where they are preparing to drop similar chemicals and then accuse the Syrian government of it.
Comparing it to the Iraq War in 2003, with claims of weapons of mass destruction since proven false.
The Iraq campaign was launched, and it finished with the destruction of the country, the growth of the terrorist threat, and nothing less than the emergence of ISIS on the international stage.
He says Russia will appeal to the international community for a full investigation of last week's chemical attack. But when Secretary Tillerson, before landing in Moscow, met with G7 nations in Italy, discussed the possibility of sanctioning Russia, for at the very least allowing there to still be chemical weapons in Syria, they were not on board.
We must have a dialogue with Russia. We must not push Russia into a corner.
As far as the rhetoric has now gone between Russia and the U.S.,
Putin's a war criminal. Assad's a war criminal. When Secretary Tillerson says he hopes that Russia will realign itself with Western democracies and break away from Syria and Iran, with all due respect, I like Secretary Tillerson. That's pretty naive.
the responsibility falls now on Tillerson, the first to sit down face-to-face with his Russian counterpart and try to gain some cooperation with the government he once considered a friend. What we've heard over the last couple of days are strong statements from a number of U.S. officials saying, for example, that the U.S. would be willing to do more militarily. But as Tillerson is getting ready for this crucial meeting with the Russian foreign minister, he seems to be being extremely careful about not projecting too hard a line. Today, he was saying things like he hopes Assad is not in Syria's future, that he hopes Russia will change course because, as he put it, what it's doing is not in Russia's best interest. Wolf?
Michelle Kaczynski in Moscow right now covering the Secretary of State's visit. Michelle, thanks very much. Now to the president's next moves in Syria amid questions, very serious questions about his policy, how far he's willing to go to push Bashar al-Assad out. Let's bring in our White House correspondent, Sarah Murray. Sarah, we're hearing from Mr. Trump in a new interview. Tell us what he just said.
That's right, Wolf. This is really the first time we've heard from him since he ordered these strikes in Syria, and there have been many questions about what else the administration might be willing to do or where they might draw the line. Listen to what President Trump had to say about that.
We're not going into Syria, but when I see people using horrible, horrible chemical weapons, which they agreed not to use under the Obama administration, but they violated it.
They said they got rid of them.
Hey, look, what I did should have been done by the Obama administration a long time before I did it. And you would have had a much better, I think Syria would be a lot better off right now than it has been.
So really the first indication, Wolf, that we have from President Trump that his view, at least on putting boots on the ground in Syria, does not appear to have evolved, even in the wake of this chemical weapons attack.
Sarah, the White House now scrambling to try to clarify a very controversial remark by Sean Spicer about Syrian gas attacks that took a surprising and offensive turn today. Update our viewers on this.
That's right. So what we heard from Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, earlier today was his attempt to just sort of, I think, frame the cruelty of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. But he leaned on a comparison that many found offensive. Listen to what Sean Spicer said.
We didn't use chemical weapons in World War II. You know, you had someone as despicable as Hitler, who didn't even sink to using chemical weapons. So you have to, if you're Russia, ask yourself: is this a country that you and a regime that you want to align yourself with? When you come to sarin gas, he was not using the gas on his own people the same way that Assad is doing. I mean, there was clearly. I understand your point. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. There was not. He brought him into to the Holocaust Center. I understand that, but I'm saying in the way that Assad used them, where he went into towns, dropped them down to innocent into the middle of towns. It was brought to so the use of it. And I appreciate the clarification there. That was not the intent.
Now, somewhat predictably today, this comment drew a lot of outrage as people were quick to point out that Hitler gassed millions of Jews, brought them to their death in gas chambers. Now, Sean Spicer moved to clarify that again after the White House briefing, this time in a written statement saying, "In no way was I trying to lessen the horrendous nature of the Holocaust. I was trying to draw a distinction of the tactic of using airplanes to drop chemical weapons on population centers. Any attack on innocent people is reprehensible and inexcusable." Wolf.
All right, Sarah, thank you. Sarah Murray reporting from the White House. Let's talk about all of this and more, the escalating tensions with Russia and Syria and North Korea. Joining us, Leon Panetta. He served as Defense Secretary and CIA Director during the Obama administration. Mr. Secretary, thanks very much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Wolf.
I want to move on to all those issues, but quickly your reaction to the White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer's comments about Hitler not using chemical weapons. We know, obviously, that was false.
Well, it's I think, a known danger that you don't compare Hitler to anybody, particularly if you're the White House Press Secretary. When I was Chief of Staff, my guidance to the Press Secretary was just answer the questions and don't embellish. And I think Mr. Spicer has to learn that lesson as well.
Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the House, says he should be fired. What do you think?
Well, again, I think he probably needs to have a good talk to make sure that when he does these press briefings, he just sticks to the questions, responds in short sentences, and doesn't embellish. Because when you start getting carried away to try to make a point, you're going to get in trouble. And he's gotten in trouble a number of times. So I just think he needs to discipline himself when he's doing those briefings.
But how many mistakes can you make realistically before your boss, the President of the United States, you're speaking for the President, says enough is enough?
Well, you know, that's something that obviously the President has to ultimately decide. But, you know, the press secretary is important. He's the one who speaks on behalf of the administration. And when he says the kind of stupid things that he did today, it hurts the administration. It changes the story. And you don't want to change the story. You want to stay focused on what the president did and what he's trying to do in dealing with Russia. That's the story. And this changes it. And that's not good.
Mr. Secretary, I want you to stand by. We have a special interview right now. The White House Press Secretary, Sean Spicer, is joining us from the North Lawn of the White House. Sean, thanks very much for joining us. I know you want to clarify what you said, but why did you even make that comparison to Hitler on gas attacks? As you know, 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, many of them with poison gas.
Well, thanks for having me, Wolf. I was obviously trying to make a point about the heinous acts that Assad had made against his own people last week, using chemical weapons and gas. And frankly, I mistakenly used an inappropriate and insensitive reference to the Holocaust, for which, frankly, there is no comparison. And for that, I apologize. It was a mistake to do that. And you know, I appreciate Director Panetta's comments, and we'll keep those in mind.
So tell us who you're apologizing to right now. There are Holocaust survivors out there who were listening to what you said and couldn't believe a spokesman, the press secretary for the President of the United States, would make such a statement. So just specifically, tell us who you want to apologize to.
Well, clearly, you know, anybody who not just suffered in the Holocaust or is a descendant of anybody, but frankly, you know, anyone who was offended by those comments. It's not, as I said, I'm not, you know, in any way standing by them. I was trying to draw a comparison for which there shouldn't have been one. It was insensitive and inappropriate. So I'm not looking to quantify this in any way. It was an attempt to talk about, I should have stayed focused on the Assad regime and the dangers that they have brought to their own people and the terrible atrocities they did, and to drag any other comparison into this was not appropriate.
But why make the comparison at all? Why bring Hitler into this?
Well, again, I'm not going to try to quantify it, Wolf. It was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it. I won't do it again. I think Director Panetta's comments were well received as advice, but it was an attempt to do something that shouldn't have been done, and that's all I can say about it. There really is no explaining it at this point. It's just to say that, especially this week, it was not something that was inappropriate, and it was insensitive. And you know, look, I think I should have stayed focused. The president obviously took decisive action last week to bring an end to the crisis in Syria, take action that hadn't been taken for the last 6 years, and the focus should have stayed on the president's action and not in any type of way of drawing anything into this.
Did you not know, Sean, that there were gas chambers where the Nazis brought Jews and others, gypsies, homosexuals, and others, mostly Jews, to slaughter them in these poison gas chambers at Birkenau, near Auschwitz, and other death camps?
Yes, clearly I'm aware of that. Again, it's as I said initially, and there's no attempt to clarify. The point was to try to talk about the use of aircraft as a means by which Assad was using this to gas his people, but it was a mistake to do that. And again, that's why I should have just stayed on topic, stayed focused on the actions that Assad had taken and the horrible atrocities he had committed against his own people.
Have you spoken to President Trump about your blunder today?
Obviously, it was my blunder, as you put it correctly, and I came out to make sure that we stay focused on what the president's doing and his decisive action. I needed to make sure that I clarified and not was in any way, shape, or form any more of a distraction from the president's decisive action in Syria and the attempts that he's making to destabilize the region and root out ISIS out of Syria. So my goal now and then was to stay focused on Assad, and I should have, and I'll continue to make sure that I stay in my lane when I talk about that.
I want to move on and talk about some other key issues, but can we assume the president encouraged you to come out and apologize?
You can assume that I realized that I had made a mistake, and I did not want to be a distraction to the president's agenda and the action he has taken, and I sought out to make sure that I clarified that.
Well, I'm glad you did. It's an important clarification, especially to those few Holocaust survivors who are still out there right now, and we're obviously very, very shocked to hear what you had to say, but I think it's very important that you came out to formally apologize and correct it. Let's talk about Syria right now. Is it believed, from your perspective, and I know you've been well briefed, that the Russians played a direct role in that initial chemical attack?
There's no consensus within the intelligence community at this time that shows a Russian involvement, but obviously the intelligence community continues to evolve the situation on the ground. The initial consensus, however, it does not lead one to believe that they can say conclusively that there was a Russian involvement.
White House officials are telling CNN they do believe Russia is trying to cover up for Bashar al-Assad's regime and its culpability. If this is true, can you really trust Russia in finding some sort of diplomatic solution to Syria?
Well, as I noted today in the briefing, when you look at the countries that are standing with Russia, Syria, North Korea, and Iran, that's not exactly a group of countries that you want to be standing with. All of them are failed states except for Russia. I think Russia is on an island to itself at this point. They are the ones who signed international agreements along with Syria, saying that they would not possess chemical weapons, never mind use them on their own people. And so I think that Russia continues to find itself isolated in this in their stance.
Does the president believe Bashar al-Assad must go?
Sure, but I think the question is, our number one priority is to make sure that we bring stability to the region and root out ISIS out of there. There's no way that I can see a stable and peaceful Syria with Bashar al-Assad in charge.
Bashar al-Assad, I know you've mispronounced his name a few times, but it's Bashar al-Assad. I know the president that you suggested yesterday that President Trump might react if barrel bombs, these awful weapons of mass destruction, were used again. But later you said there was no new policy. Could you clarify precisely where the president stands on the use of barrel bombs if there's another so-called red line?
I think it's a combination of a bunch of things. And I made very clear yesterday that unlike the past administration, we aren't drawing red lines in the sand, that there are a combination of lines that were crossed last week, particularly the use of chemical weapons against babies and children, that really made the president want to make sure he took decisive action, which he did. And the world community, both here at home and around the world, heads of state, responded and with widespread praise because of that.
We need to go, but let me ask you one final question, because, as you know, you're the press secretary for the President of the United States at the White House. This is not the first time your comments from the White House, from the lectern there, have been criticized. Are you worried, Sean, that you have a credibility problem right now?
No, I think this is why I'm here right now, Wolf. You know, I think I clearly, as I said earlier to you, to your audience, when you make a mistake, you own it. My comments today did not reflect the president's, were a distraction from him, and frankly were just misstated, insensitive, and wrong. And I wanted to make sure I clarified them as soon as possible. So I appreciate you having me on, but I think that one of the things that I think is important is we all make mistakes. You've made mistakes, other outlets, me, and everybody does. And we all hopefully have a bit of forgiveness in us. And I hope that people who understand know that when I make a mistake, I'll try to own it, and I would ask people for their forgiveness.
Sean Spicer, it was good of you to come out and apologize to the American people, indeed to people all over the world, for your mistake today. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf.
Let's get back to Leon Panetta, the former defense secretary, the former CIA director. You just heard him apologize. Not very often you hear a White House official in this new administration being willing to do so, but he was very robust in that apology. He admitted it was a major blunder. Your reaction, Mr. Secretary?
Well, I think it was the right thing to do. I'm glad he did it. It's important to set the record straight and to make clear that that the American people, and particularly those whose families died in the Holocaust, understand that he's apologizing to them. So I'm glad he did it, and hopefully all of us can move on.
Is it over now, you think, as far as this robust apology we just heard from Sean Spicer? Is there anything else he or others in the Trump administration you believe need to do? For example, make a visit over to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., only a few blocks from the White House, and do it at a high level?
Well, it is Passover, and it's probably not a bad thing to recognize the importance of that event for for those that that are part of that faith. But I think right now, look, we all know Washington. This is the kind of story that'll bounce around for a while, but hopefully we'll all refocus on the key issues that this country's facing.
Let's talk about some of those key issues right now. You hear that there's some confusion. There's no consensus in the U.S. intelligence community about whether the Russians actually played a direct role in that chemical weapons attack against those Syrian civilians, including those children. You used to be the CIA director. Walk us through what's probably going on as far as trying to come up with an assessment.
Well, there's no question that they're probably, exhausting every resource that they have in country to try to determine whether or not the Russians were complicit here. It is clear from what Jim Mattis said today that we have very clear evidence that Assad is responsible for that chemical attack, that Syria is responsible for what happened to those innocent men, women, and children. And I think that is the issue that now needs to be brought to the Russians by Secretary Tillerson. As to whether or not we ever develop evidence that might indicate that the Russians knew about what was happening, I think that's going to probably be tough to pin down. But the Russians are at that air base. They knew that there are chemical weapons there. There certainly is some smoke here. Whether there's flames or not, we'll find out.
Mr. Secretary, there's a lot more for us to discuss. I want to take a quick break. Back with the former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta as North Korea makes new threats against the United States in response to the deployment of American warships moving closer and closer to the Korean Peninsula right now. Mr. Secretary, North Korea warned it's ready to react to any mode of war desired by the U.S. if the U.S. were to make moves toward a preemptive strike. How serious of a threat is this right now?
Well, as we all know, North Korea and the leader of North Korea makes a habit of making those kinds of threats. We understand that in the end, the leader recognizes that if he does anything that involves any kind of attack, that his regime is over. That's a reality. So I think what we're looking at, Wolf, is that, we have this event coming up on April 15th, which is the birthday of the founder of North Korea. And every time these special events take place, the North Koreans usually engage in some kind of provocative act. So I would not be surprised if they use that event in order to either send off a missile or do a nuclear test or do something that is provocative. But as always, I think we have to be prepared to make sure that it doesn't cross that line that we would consider some kind of direct attack either on South Korea or Japan or on the United States.
Tell us a little bit about Kim Jong-un, how unpredictable this young leader of North Korea is. We had, I think, a lot better information about his father, but take us a little bit behind the scenes and what we can anticipate from Kim Jong-un.
Well, he is, without question, very unpredictable, although he comes from a long bloodline of very unpredictable and unstable leaders. He's somebody who obviously has acted against those who he suspects are not loyal to him. He's killed a number of members, not only of his family, but of the military individuals that are close to the leader. He obviously killed or was involved in the killing of his own brother. So we know that he is somebody who obviously is concerned about loyalty. He's tightening his reins on that position. He obviously is trying to maintain very tight control. But I think what I'm concerned about the most is that every leader of North Korea has to understand that at some point you've got to improve the economy of North Korea. You've got to improve the situation with the people of North Korea. And yet every one of these leaders focuses on militarization, on developing missiles, on spending their economic wealth on focusing on military areas as opposed to developing their economy. And I think ultimately they will pay the price for that, one way or the other. This regime cannot last based on what they're doing.
As you know, the president tweeted today that the U.S. will solve the North Korean problem alone if China refuses to help. Do you think a unilateral move against North Korea is the right move, given all the dangers it could potentially develop?
No, I don't think that's the right move. I think that what we need to do right now is to obviously increase our support and strengthen the defenses in South Korea, in Japan, as we have been doing, which I think is important. I think, secondly, we ought to take steps to tighten the sanctions on North Korea. There are sanctions now, but very frankly, they're not as tough as they should be. They're not as tough as the ones we had in Iran. So I think we ought to try to toughen up those sanctions. And then thirdly, continue the pressure on China to try to work with the North Koreans to ultimately agree to some kind of negotiation in the future. That's what we ought to focus on. I think the problem with doing anything unilaterally and suddenly trying to conduct some kind of attack in North Korea, and obviously we have all kinds of plans to look at those kinds of targets. But the problem is that we don't know the consequences. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how effective those kinds of pinpoint attacks can be. And they could produce horrendous consequences with the reaction we could get from North Korea. I mean, we would be in a war on the Korean Peninsula. And so I just think we need to be very careful. We can be tough, but at the same time be careful about how we deal with North Korea.
Leon Panetta, the former defense secretary. Thanks, Mr. Secretary, for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf.
We're getting a lot of reaction coming into the Situation Room. The reaction to my interview with Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary. You heard his robust apology for his blunder in making that comparison to Hitler. Much more on that and all the day's news right after this. We got the breaking news. You just saw it live here in the Situation Room. Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, a robust apology for him for a major blunder on his part, making a comparison to what's going on in Syria to Hitler, saying that was a big mistake. Listen to what Sean Spicer said to us just a few moments ago.
I was obviously trying to make a point about the heinous acts that Assad had made against his own people last week, using chemical weapons and gas. And frankly, I mistakenly used an inappropriate and insensitive reference to the Holocaust, for which, frankly, there is no comparison. And for that, I apologize. It was a mistake to do that.
All right, let's bring in our experts, our analysts, Abby, Phillip, you cover the White House. How often have we heard in this administration a senior official come on television and issue such a formal public apology?
Really incredibly rarely. I mean, I think the only other time I can think of is when Kellyanne Conway went out in the public and she was pitching Ivanka Trump's products, and that situation created an ethics complaint, which is a legal problem for them. In this case, it was Sean Spicer essentially apologizing for something that was almost universally thought to be completely inappropriate, and it was a real apology. It wasn't a if anybody was offended apology. It was a real one, and I think that's pretty significant for this White House that has very publicly said that they don't believe in sort of giving their enemies any more fodder by admitting mistakes.
Let me play another clip, David. This is from the interview with Sean Spicer. Listen to this. Tell us who you're apologizing to right now. There are Holocaust survivors out there who were listening to what you said and couldn't believe a spokesman, the press secretary for the President of the United States, would make such a statement. So just specifically, tell us who you want to apologize to.
Well, clearly, anybody who not just suffered in the Holocaust or is a descendant of anybody, but frankly, anyone who was offended by those comments. It's not, as I said, I'm not, in any way standing by them. I was trying to draw a comparison for which there shouldn't have been one. It was insensitive and inappropriate. So I'm not looking to quantify this in any way. It was an attempt to talk about, I should have stayed focused on the Assad regime and the dangers that they have brought to their own people and the terrible atrocities they did, and to drag any other comparison into this was not appropriate.
But why make the comparison at all? Why bring Hitler into this?
Well, again, I'm not going to try to quantify it. Well, if it was a mistake, I shouldn't have done it. I won't do it again.
That was pretty amazing to hear that kind of robust apology from the White House press secretary. He did the right thing.
He did the right thing. It was a robust apology, and it was important that you pressed him on that point, Wolf, because oftentimes public figures make these general apologies and never specifically say who they're apologizing to. In this case, he clearly owed an apology at least to Holocaust survivors and their families, and also to the American public, because they expect better from the press secretary. I think this apology came so swiftly, in part because the White House has become more sensitive to the fact that these verbal gaffes and mistakes are piling up on them and really costing them trust with the American public.
Yeah, it could be part of a new strategy. You make a bad statement, you go out and you try to fix it, you correct it, instead of trying to cover it up and move on.
Yeah, and I think Press Secretary Spicer did that.
And I think for this White House, they've had a number of run-ins with the Holocaust, repeatedly making blunders that force their allies to come to their defense. That gets tiring over time, and at some point, they needed to show their willingness to be contrite, to correct mistakes, and to move forward. It's not something that can be sustained forever, where everyone gives them the benefit of the doubt for making mistakes that are offensive and that are meaningful to people who have families who survived the Holocaust or who themselves survived the Holocaust.
And, for the president, Tara, this hits home. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Kushner's grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So this is something that really, really hits home to the entire Trump family, and especially at a time like this during these days of Passover.
Absolutely. Not only was it an offensive remark, you should never be comparing the atrocities of one dictator to another. You should never be trying to make moral equivalence or lack of moral equivalence between the killing of individuals in gas chambers and a chemical attack. These are all horrible, humanitarian, terrible atrocities, situations. And for Sean Spicer to make that comparison, not only is it offensive, it's distracting. There's a lot on the agenda today. There's a G7 summit meeting. There's Rex Tillerson going to Russia. There are issues that the administration wants to be focused on. So I think they wanted to do their cleanup fast, and I think that's smart. I'm all for apologies. I'm all for personal responsibility and self-awareness. And this was one example of the administration doing that when they haven't traditionally done that in the past.
Abby, listen to this other clip. This is from the interview I just did with Sean Spicer. Listen to this. Have you spoken to President Trump about your blunder today?
Obviously, it was my blunder, as you put it correctly, and I came out to make sure that we stay focused on what the president's doing and his decisive action. I needed to make sure that I clarified and not was in any way, shape, or form any more of a distraction from the president's decisive action in Syria and the attempts that he's making to destabilize the region and root out ISIS out of Syria. So my goal now and then was to stay focused on Assad, and I should have, and I'll continue to make sure that I stay in my lane when I talk about that.
I want to move on and talk about some other key issues, but can we assume the president encouraged you to come out and apologize?
You can assume that I realized that I had made a mistake, and I did not want to be a distraction to the president's agenda and the action he has taken, and I sought out to make sure that I clarified that.
So, Abby, I can only assume the president must have been very, very angry.
Yeah, and as you know, Wolf, he watches those briefings. He's a very voracious watcher of television, and it is on every single day. And for that moment to really take off on social media would not have gone unnoticed from this president. And beyond that, as Spicer pointed out in his interview, it is a distraction from a moment when the White House wants to be talking about how the president moved forward on Syria. He did something where his predecessor failed to do. That's the narrative that they want to have. And this moment for Sean Spicer really overtook that. And that's something that the president does not like.
And a press secretary, and I'm a former White House correspondent, you have to have credibility out there, not just with the reporters on the White House beat, but with the American public, indeed people all over the world. That's why I asked him this question, David. Listen to this. As you know, you're the press secretary for the President of the United States at the White House. This is not the first time your comments from the White House, from the lectern there, have been criticized. Are you worried, Sean, that you have a credibility problem right now?
No, I think this is why I'm here right now, Wolf. You know, I think I clearly, as I said earlier to you, to your audience, when you make a mistake, you own it. My comments today did not reflect the president's, were a distraction from him, and frankly were just misstated, insensitive, and wrong. And I wanted to make sure I clarified them as soon as possible. So I appreciate you having me on, but I think that one of the things that I think is important is we all make mistakes. You've made mistakes, other outlets, me, and everybody does. And we all hopefully have a bit of forgiveness in us. And I hope that people who understand know that when I make a mistake, I'll try to own it, and I would ask people for their forgiveness.
That's, you know, as I said before, that you don't hear that very often from this administration asking for forgiveness.
No, it was very robust. He said more than once to you, Wolf, that he did make a mistake. He owned it. He should get credit for that. But he does have a credibility problem, Wolf. Look, today he went out there in the briefing. He mispronounced Bashar al-Assad's name more than once, I think. He referred to Iran as a failed state more than once. Whatever people think about Iran, it's not a failed state. It's a regional power. And he also got into this thing where, as Tara said, he made a comparison between Hitler and the Holocaust and another atrocity, which is never a good idea. They did try and clean it up, but I think they see now that they can't let their war of words get ahead of what they're actually trying to do.
Do they have to do something, Tara, that will underscore this understanding of the enormity of the mistake that the White House press secretary made? For example, in a few weeks, there's a big dinner that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington is having. They have it every year. It's probably a dinner that at least Sean Spicer might want to attend, if not go to an actual tour of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
I think that's a good point. I think the real issue here is it goes not just to the offensive nature of the comment, but it goes to the expertise and credibility surrounding foreign policy issues. The administration has a number of serious issues on its plate right now, from North Korea nuclear potential missile tests in the upcoming weeks to a safe haven of ISIS in Syria to what they're doing with the Assad regime and a chemical attack that they responded to, and no one's clear in terms of what comes next. These types of issues, when you're mispronouncing foreign leaders' names, when you're making statements about atrocities that aren't historically accurate, to be frank. The Holocaust, millions of people were in gas chambers, so his comments just weren't even accurate. So when you make those kind of gaffes over and over again, apologizing for them is great because it shows that you're aware that you made the mistake, but it goes to your credibility, particularly on foreign policy issues. This is the press secretary at the White House. You have to be you can't really afford mistakes in that role. It's a very important role, and it's very important in terms of not just the domestic audience, but internationally. One general rule, don't make gaffes at the podium at the White House, and, don't make gaffes on your tweets at 3 a.m. If they could just, stick to those, that might help U.S. foreign policy.
Sean Spicer, he did the right thing. He came out and he apologized. That's very significant. Just ahead, new threats and growing tension as U.S. warships approach North Korea. Plus, President Trump's travel tab. How much are those Florida Gulf outings costing American taxpayers? A sharp exchange of threats between the Kim Jong-un regime and President Trump has tension growing on the Korean Peninsula right now. CNN's Brian Todd is working the story for us. Brian, North Korea is making new threats as the U.S. warships approach the region.
They certainly are, Wolf. Tonight, we're told U.S. intelligence officials are watching for any signs that North Korea will conduct another nuclear or missile test in the coming days, including the birthday of Kim Jong-un's grandfather this Saturday. Now, this comes as tensions on the Korean Peninsula are at their highest levels in years, with an ominous warning coming earlier today from Kim.
A stunning new look tonight at the public facade of the brutal North Korean regime. Kim Jong-un, in newly released video, strutting center stage at a gathering of his hand-picked elites, who dutifully applaud the dictator. On state TV, a fawning news anchor narrates the gathering, the Supreme People's Assembly. At the same time Kim Jong-un is conducting this show of political force, Kim's regime is warning America over the deployment of the U.S. aircraft carrier Carl Vinson and its strike group to the waters off the Korean Peninsula. Calling it an act of aggression, a regime statement hand-delivered to CNN says, quote, if the U.S. dares to choose a military option, the DPRK is willing and ready to react to any mode of war desired by the U.S.
I think it's North Korea essentially saying, look, we are pursuing nuclear weapons for a reason. This is exactly why. You are the world's most powerful nuclear power. If you dare to strike us, we will strike back.
A U.S. defense official tells CNN the carrier group was sent to patrol near North Korea because of Kim's recent provocations. His missile tests and tests of engines for intercontinental ballistic missiles. Tonight, CNN is learning more specific information about what the U.S. carrier group could do off North Korea's coast if ever ordered to strike. Analysts say the Vinson strike group has 2 destroyers and a cruiser with more than 300 combined missile tubes. They carry the same types of Tomahawk missiles the U.S. fired into Syria and could shoot down some North Korean missiles if they're test fired.
The CG-47, the Lake Champlain, this smaller ship on the right, carries over 100 vertical launch missiles. Some of those would be equipped to be able to interdict a shorter or medium range ballistic missile.
Will those American warships be ordered to shoot down North Korean missiles if they're test fired while the carrier group is nearby? Pentagon officials won't comment. But the movement of the warships comes as President Trump tweets North Korea is looking for trouble, and that if China doesn't help, quote, we will solve the problem without them. Experts worry tonight about a point of no return for the tough-talking leaders of the U.S. and North Korea.
The two leaders could indeed be headed for a collision course, essentially a game of chicken. And many worry that once they're on this path, there's no U-turn or left turn or stop.
And don't look for China to help steer the two leaders off that path, despite President Trump's messages to China, even saying that a Chinese trade deal with the U.S. would be better for Beijing if it helps with North Korea. The Chinese president has made no promises of specific action to rein in Kim Jong-un. Wolf?
Brian, how vulnerable is that U.S. aircraft carrier strike force to a potential North Korean attack if Kim's regime decides to go after it?
Well, Wolf, there are 3 things that Kim could throw at that carrier group. He could throw ballistic missiles, attack planes, and submarines. But one weapons expert tells us the Vinson strike group is ready for all 3. He says North Korea's missiles are not sophisticated enough to hit the carrier group before they would be blasted out of the sky. North Korean planes wouldn't stand a chance against the American attack planes on the carrier. And he says the U.S. would deploy attack submarines along with the carrier group, which could detect and take out North Korean subs, which this expert says are very noisy.
Brian Todd reporting for us. Thanks very much, Brian. A final story for us tonight. The cost of President Trump's frequent trips to his Florida resort clearly adding up. He's now on track to spend more on travel in his first year in office than President Obama did in 8 years. Seeing as Tom Foreman has been looking into all of this for us. Tom, the president, heading back to Florida later this week?
Yeah, and at the very time that he's saying to other government agencies, you need to be more frugal, you need to save money, he still appears to be acting like a jet-setting billionaire on the taxpayer's dime.
The president keeps taking off and the bills keep piling up. The latest getaway itinerary?
The president plans to spend the Easter holiday in Florida, and he'll return to the White House on Sunday.
Since assuming office, President Trump has spent 6 weekends at his Florida resort, Mar-a-Lago, for a Super Bowl party in early February, a meeting and dinner with the Japanese Prime Minister, a little golf the weekend after that, a little more golf 2 weeks later, still a few more holes in mid-March, and then his meeting in early April with the Chinese president. To be sure, he ordered the strike on Syria during that last visit, and his staff insist he is always working.
And I think the president, wherever he goes, he carries the apparatus for the White House with us. That is just something that happens.
But in just 80 days, Trump's travels have cost taxpayers an estimated $21 million, all while drawing attention to and boosting the value of his private properties. Membership fees at Mar-a-Lago, for example, have already doubled to $200,000. The Secret Service insists it can handle the load of protecting all that travel. The head of Homeland Security notes agents are pulling long shifts.
We need a larger Secret Service because we need to get some of these people a little bit of time at home with their families.
Law enforcement officials in Florida say they too are spending tens of thousands a day and working their officers as if a hurricane is hit.
Which is 12-hour shifts and canceled vacations. And we're going to use all of our manpower that we have at our fingertips.
And in New York, where First Lady Melania Trump lives, taxpayers are shelling out up to $146,000 a day to secure Trump Tower.
The White House says as summer comes on, the president's trips to his Florida resort will decrease, but there are indications that will just mean more visits to other Trump resorts in New Jersey and in Virginia. Wolf?
Tom Foreman reporting for us. Tom, thanks very much. That's it for me. Thanks for watching. Aaron Burnett Out Front starts right now.